because I know there's some folks that are online as well.
Brenham,
Here.
Pugh, McBride,
Here.
Livingston,
Here?
Teratio, Weaver, Barron, Walker, Mackey,
Here.
English, Newton.
Thank you. I know there are several council members who said they will join us online. Let me just start before Mr. Rubin in terms of introductions. Just remember, this is a work session. We won't be making any decisions or anything of that particular nature today. I think it's important for as many council members as possible to be here, because I think economic development is probably the most important thing we do in the county. We have a lot of agencies that does a whole lot of things, whether it's the sheriff department, whether it's probate court, transportation, whatever it is. They all require funding. As you know, our state provide a lot of statutes and regulations, but don't send the money with it. So we have an obligation to make sure we generate the funding. So in my opinion, I think this is one of our most important obligations. Mr. Rubel, you have the floor.
I should know how to do that by now. Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just as a quick introduction, our office has talked really since its inception, had discussions with council about the potential of a public-private. In the last year, or maybe the last 6 months or so, I recognize that the reason we hadn't gotten very far with it was because of me. I was too busy doing other things. It was sitting on the corner of my desk, and I turned to the folks I turned to for a lot of things. I turned to Ray Jones, and I said, Ray, can you help me run this to ground? Yes or no, I just want it off the corner of my desk. We need to make a determination. So with that said, I'd like to, Mr. Chair, with your permission, turn it over to Ray Jones.
Thanks. Everybody hear me okay? So what I want to do is I want to step through a PowerPoint that we've put together. And much of what I'm going to talk about from that PowerPoint is a document that the council received as a strategic planning document. We'll talk through that a little bit. We'll have some hard copies for you to take with you of everything. They'll be here shortly, because they're not decisions being made tonight, but hopefully there'll be questions that come up and things that we learn we need to continue to work through. I think that's the real goal, and also to get some input from members of council, whether they be with us here in the room or whether they be online. So I have a couple of goals today. One is I do want to just sort of remind everybody about how we got here. I know y'all, there's been a lot going on even in the beginning of 2023, so I want to make sure we're all clear on how we got here and why we're here. Then I want to talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of the nonprofit itself. I have some questions for y'all. There's some feedback I think that we need on a couple of points. And then you'll see at the end, I think if once you get through this, you have the same feeling I do, I think it's likely that it might be useful for us to get together again to talk through some different aspects of the public-private partnership idea. And so you'll see in our next steps section that we're going to propose perhaps that we have another work session if it's the will of the council, maybe even 2 more work sessions if it's the will of the council, just to ensure that we've given this the proper airtime and make sure that we've heard all the various opinions from council and from the other stakeholders. So with that, I think we've got a PowerPoint. If I think Madam Clerk may have it, we can kind of start and work through that a little bit. If we go to the first slide, can everybody see that from where your vantage point? Okay. We can go ahead and advance it to the very first slide. I want to talk through a little bit. So this slide really is looking backwards a little bit. Y'all may remember we were all fairly busy in 2020 with a very unexpected event, a pandemic. But at the same time, County Council had been talking for a number of months about the need to have a strategic plan for economic development. And so toward the end of 2019 and in the beginning of 2020, the county reached out to a number of national providers for strategic plans and ultimately hired the TIP Strategies Group out of Austin, Texas, to perform a strategic plan. I think, Ms. McBride, you may have been the chair of EDC at that time, probably had some involvement in us sorting through, because we had some good response to the strategic plan bid request, if you will. And so they began their work in April of 2020, and they worked for about 9 months. And within that 9-month period, they did a couple of things. First, they talked to folks inside of our house. They talked to 20 to 25 stakeholders, internal stakeholders, which I believe included not only members of council, but staff at the time, and just other folks to get a sense of how economic development works in Richland County. They also talked to, believe it or not, they reached out to several hundred exterior stakeholders with a survey, and over 100 of them responded to that survey, which I think is a remarkable indication of the interest that folks have in economic development here in Richland County. And so the end product of that is around February of 2021, the TIP Strategies Group presented a strategic plan to Richland County, which was then presented to the members of council that were sitting at the time in April of 2021. If I recall, I believe there was a work session April 6th, somewhere in there. And I recognize, Mr. Branham, you were not part of that work session, which is one of the reasons I wanted to kind of look back a little bit and talk about how we got here. But one of the major findings that the TIP Strategies Group had, they came up with 4 goals, and the goals are not unexpected, right? The goals were for us to engage in an even greater and more material way with our existing business, because a lot of times an existing customer is going to be somebody who's going to be willing to invest again more quickly. They talked about our need to market and have a brand for Richland County. They talked about strategies for us to pursue certain kinds of industries, and interestingly enough, a lot of that is going on right now. And finally, they talked about ways to sort of broaden the global sort of reach of our economic development effort. In order to accomplish those goals, and this is where we're going to focus today, one of the significant findings that they had was that we needed to look at the way we do economic development. And the very consultant that we hired to do our plan and paid them, I think, $75,000, so this was not a light undertaking, they came back with a very interesting finding, which is summarized here on the slide. And I'll just give you the upshot of it. The upshot of it was that we needed to engage the private sector more in our economic development efforts. And in order to do that, they suggested that we form a public-private partnership consistent with what they're seeing across the country to engage the private sector in Richland County to get them involved in economic development, to leverage their resources, to leverage their relationships, all for the benefit and to do exactly what you just said, Mr. Livingston, to bring more business and more jobs to Richland County. So it was that finding that we should pursue a public-private partnership that sort of started us on the way of having these conversations. And again, that finding came out in April. It was presented to council in April of 21. I don't recall, Ms. McBride, whether the EDC had other conversations about it at the time, but I know that the council's strategic retreat, I believe in 2021, also involved a discussion of public-private partnerships. So that sort of took us to the next step, and we began working through the idea of a public-private partnership in earnest starting in the middle of last year. And we brought a resolution to council. I believe it was your predecessor's very last meeting, Mr. Branham, because Mr. Malinowski and I had some conversations that night, where we asked the county council, based upon what we have so far, do we want to continue to walk forward and examine this opportunity for Richland County? There were a number of good questions asked that night. Part of the purpose of this work session is to answer some of those questions and to find out if there are other questions. But ultimately, the county council decided to take the next step and continue with this inquiry, continue with looking at the benefits, looking at the pluses, the minuses of having a public-private partnership. But make no mistake, the reason I am standing in front of you today is because when the county reached out to a national expert and asked that they come in and look at how the county undertakes its economic development process, that national expert that we picked from a number of folks that could have done our strategic plan said, for you to evolve, you should consider the formation of a public-private partnership. So we can go to the next slide. I think one of the critical questions that I even asked the first time that Jeff came to me and said, and maybe click it one more time to bring it all in. One of the critical things that I even asked Jeff the first time we talked about this is I said, okay, so what do we get from a public-private partnership that we don't have now? And so we talked about a couple of things. And these are also themes that the strategic planning firm identified. One was competitiveness. And so competitiveness is a broad topic, but they observed that in the parts of the country that have been historically successful in recruiting jobs and investment, that the local governments had found a way to effectively partner with the private sector, often using a public-private partnership model to do so. What does that enable you to do? Well, you have other people on your team. You make your team bigger. All of you have constituents who have a lot of different needs. Some of your constituents are concerned about economic development, others are not. Some are more concerned about trash pickup and other public services than they are economic development. And so you all are pulled in a number of different directions as council members. We have a county department that focuses on the nuts and bolts of economic development, but could certainly use the support of the private sector. And so having private sector investors, both of their time and their dollars, is intended to enhance the competitiveness of Richland County's economic development efforts. The other thing that we think is important, and we're already seeing this now. I mean, y'all have been witness to all of the economic development activity that has been going on in the county the last 6 months, and all of the various meetings that have gone on, and some of you have had to participate in those meetings. And in order to try to engage the private sector to help support those efforts, it's been sort of a grab as grab can kind of effort. In other words, there are people out there that say, hey, we're willing to help, let us know. But we do not have an identified set of private sector individuals and companies who are bought in to our economic development efforts, who will say, hey, that next big company that comes by, have them come see us. We want to be here to talk about what a good place Richland County is to do business. So that's a critical aspect of this effort. The fundraising element of this, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in just a minute, because what we've been able to do, and I can't remember if it was Ms. McBride or Ms. Mackey, or at the last time we were all together to discuss this, there was some conversation about what are other people doing, how do they do it, are there some things we might be able to take from them, are there some things we need to look at differently and more of a fresh perspective. And so one of the things we did is we tried to find out, for those that are doing public-private partnerships around South Carolina, how much of their funding is truly public and how much of it is private. Private funding tends to be funding that is focused solely on marketing. In other words, telling the world about Richland County. In this case, that is what we want to raise private dollars to do, to focus marketing efforts on the county. You might say, now, aren't we part of other marketing regimes that pick up the county? The answer to that is certainly yes, but even our consultant observed that the efforts of the state focus first on the state, and that's fine. Nobody begrudges the fact that State Department of Commerce is selling all of South Carolina. I'm glad they do. The efforts of even the local regional alliances, to the extent they are talking about central South Carolina, they're talking about central South Carolina. They're not just talking about Richland County. And so the observation from our consultant was, we need to be talking, somebody needs to be talking, telling the world about Richland County. And we'll talk a little bit further about the assets we have, but they're significant and they're paying off. We can go to the next slide, Madam Clerk. Thank you. So I'm going to get into a couple of good questions that were posed at our last meeting. And those questions really, I think, fell into two categories. One is, what's this going to look like? What's going to be different if we have a P3 in terms of how the county does economic development? What's the P3's role? What's the council's role? Who is making what decision? who has control over what function? I think those are critical questions, and we're going to talk about those in some detail. But I wanted to lead with, what do we envision the board will do? And again, the activation of this board is not anything that, we're not making this up as we go. We're following the plan that's been provided by the folks that we hired to make a plan. And their suggestion was, you're going to get roughly 4 different functions out of a P3 board. Hopefully you'll get some fundraising. We want them engaged. That goes back to just having people willing to talk to other business people about Richland County. We want them to invest not just money, but if anyone, if any group of people understands the investment of time, you all do, we want to have some of our private sector folks committed to invest time in this effort. And then finally, to the extent that there is advice that we can use collectively that can come from the private sector, advice about where to go next, advice about, there are reasons that certain kinds of companies may come here or may not come here, advice about what they're seeing out in the labor pool. So giving us the ability maybe to even be in a leadership role in our communities by having conversations with our, our friends in education and our friends in technical education to say, hey, we as the county, we're engaging with the private sector. They're giving us some feedback about the kinds of workers they need and the kinds of jobs that aren't getting filled. Can you help us get those things organized? So by engaging with the private sector, we're hopeful it puts the county in a position to take more of a leadership role in some of those conversations. Could you go to the next slide, please? One more, there we go. Okay, so let's start with, how do we envision county council involvement and control? And so I broke this up really into 3 different areas, and I broke it up into, what are we doing now? And then the red bar would be, what would it look like if we have a P3, okay? I think, based upon as long as I've been around here, I think there are 3 critical things that our council does on economic development. First is it deals with the budget. It determines how to make the investment. Second, it is council's job and only council's job to approve the incentive packages that are given to the economic development prospects. And third, council has been instrumental in forming the Economic Development Office, and it sits under the auspices of at least one county council committee. So being involved with and being connected to economic development through the EDO, I think, is a critical function of county council. So currently, who approves the budget? Obviously, it's the county council, right? I mean, it winds its way through lots of steps and through, Ms. Thomas's, Mr. Rubel, Mr. Thomas, Mr. Brown, and I'm sure others, but ultimately it lands with you. 2, who approves incentives? Well, currently, the Economic Development Committee would be the first sort of wave of review of an incentive request, and then ultimately any incentives would come before the county council to be voted on, most often by ordinance with a public hearing. Finally, the Economic Development Office. Currently, they obviously sit under the auspices of the county. It's a county department with county employees. All right. If we have a P3, how's this going to work? First, let's talk about budget. The budget for economic development would still be approved by the county council. County council would have to make a decision about how it will fund, what kind of contribution it will make to the P3. As I said earlier, we have done our homework and recognized that the majority of P3 organizations in South Carolina are typically 80 to 90% funded by public dollars. So make no mistake, the P3 effort, without the budgetary support of the county council and the decision by county council to make those budgetary appropriations, the P3 effort would fail. So approving the budget under a P3 remains with the county council. Importantly, who approves the incentives? The answer is the EDC will vet them and bring them to the county council, just like it does now. Now, might there be a situation where the nonprofit board is engaged to help determine if there's anything special that needs to be put on the table before it comes to EDC to be voted on and thought about by the county council? Maybe, maybe not. But the approval of incentives by statute resides with this council. It can't be delegated out to a P3. So there'll never be an incentive contract in Richland County that's not approved by this county council. There won't be an incentive package that isn't first vetted by the EDC before it comes to council. So we envision the process and council's role in that process will be identical to what it is now, with hopefully the ability to get some advice and or some support from the P3 board. And when I say advice, you know, a number of you have sat as we've looked at a lot of these commercial developments, right? We talked about these at the last meeting I was at, Ms. McBride, talking about, my goodness, you know, we're seeing so many of these. It would be really hugely helpful for somebody to be able to give us some additional advice and input about the nature of these incentives, about the nature of what's going on in other communities. And so in a situation like that, I think it'd be interesting and helpful for the EDC to know what the position is of the P3 board. Like, what advice do they have about granting these types of incentives? What advice do they have about focusing them, about sharpening them? Not mandates, but advice, right? Coming alongside the council. It's ultimately still the EDC and the council's decision about how to do things. The final thing we've talked about, and this again comes directly from the strategic plan. The strategic plan that was delivered to us says that most of the time when there's a P3, that the economic development function that has heretofore been sitting under the council is transferred to the P3. Does that mean it has to work that way? Not necessarily. In fact, we've talked to a number of different groups throughout the state trying to understand how things are structured exactly. And I'll be honest with you, it's a mixed bag. Some folks have the executive director and all employees that sit up under the P3, and even though they're able, because of PIBA, because of the rules of PIBA, to still get county benefits and still get state retirement, they're employees of the P3, and the P3 pays their salaries. I've seen that. And we've also seen situations where the employees remain employees of the county, but effectively are working for or doing work for the P3. So we've seen both. The recommendation that was in the strategic plan is that all of it be consolidated under the P3. So we bring you that specifically as part of that plan. So that would be a difference, but there would be no difference in the budget and or the approval of incentives. Can we go to the next slide, Madam Clerk? The other thing I want to talk a little bit about, and I may invite Mr. Rubel just to make sure, because I'm kind of stepping into his world a little bit. But, you know, we just talked about what the county council's role is. We talked about, you know, what the county council's control would be. But I think it's also important to talk about, like, the process, you know, and what our economic development office is actually doing, and talk about what they do currently, and then how would that change if that function is brought under the P3. If I'm sitting in your shoes, I think I want to understand that better. And so that's why we made this slide. So we developed, again, I do things in threes. It drives my wife nuts. But so I broke it up into three things: marketing, lead, follow-up, effectively interacting with projects, and then what happens after somebody announces they're going to locate here, the connections we're making for folks in the market. So marketing, that's on the front end; lead, follow-up, dealing with projects directly; and then what happens after somebody announces they're going to come. You know, what kind of marketing connections are we able to make? So right now, from the marketing side, we work with a number of different organizations to generate leads, to go out, to spend money, to spend marketing dollars, and hopefully for our benefit. I mentioned them earlier. Those organizations tend to have a state or a regional focus, not a Richland County focus. So are we fortunate that we happen to have one of the best sites in the Southeast in the state of South Carolina in Blythewood? Yes, we are. And we've been fortunate that lots of folks want to look at it. Is anybody, heretofore, before we had that site, was there anybody else looking around saying, we ought to be thinking more about that, you know, this area of the county? Was there anybody really thinking about that for us other than us? And the answer is no. So we're relying largely on state and regional efforts for marketing. We think that would change, and I'll talk about in just a minute when we get to the P3. In terms of how we follow up with leads, so if we get an opportunity, then how do we follow up? That's largely happening through our economic development office, right? Which is, you know, we've got Terry, who's the director. I'm sorry, Mr. Rubel, who's the director. You know, Terry and Ty. So we've got, you know, three folks who are simultaneously trying to market, trying to follow up with leads, trying to deal with projects, and then trying to deal with existing industry. So all of that follow-up right now is happening really through the auspices of our office. And then what happens after the fact? So like, once we get somebody here, we want them to become part of the community, right? I mean, it's one thing to say that somebody's making a decision to locate here. It's another thing to say we've helped them become part and integrated into our community. How do we do that? How do we make those connections, not just to community leaders, but to other business leaders in this community, so that when somebody says, hey, how do you solve this problem or that problem, they know who to go to? How do we do that? Because our staff is largely having to move to the next project, because there's so much going on. And so we believe that there's some additional things we can do there. So what might change if we had a P3? What might look different? Make no mistake that the marketing aspect would be different. And Madam Clerk, we've got hard copies right behind you if you want to hand those out to a few folks. Make no mistake that we think being able to raise additional money from the private sector to talk not about our region and not about our state, but to talk about our county, where we all live, where our children have grown up, where a lot of us went to school, to focus on what's happening here. We think raising money through the P3, that will be one of the primary benefits. And when you go back and look at the strategic plan, one of the weaknesses they point out is the fact that nobody is spending time to market just Richland County. That the efforts that have been underway are largely being done on a regional basis. So that's critical. What about lead follow-up? What does that look like? One of the things we believe would be hugely beneficial if we had a P3 would be to engage the private sector in simple conversations. So we identify our private sector stakeholders, right, because they're part of our P3. Let's say that one of them is in a business that's in a line of business where we know we have a lead that has been generated for our community. It is as simple as calling up a member of our board or somebody else who's involved and saying, do you know Joe Smith with XYZ company who happens to be either in your supply chain or is doing business similar to what you do? Can you help us talk to Joe Smith? As a business person, can you help us? Can you be part of the team that is trying to get Joe Smith engaged? That's what we're talking about, right? Being able to leverage private assets to go help us chase leads. What's in front of you, by the way, is just three things. It's a copy of the PowerPoint I'm going through right now. If you don't have the strategic plan handy, the one I've been talking about, it's in there too. And the last one is the current set of bylaws, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So, and you're able to take those with you. I want you all to have a chance to sit, look at those. Hopefully we'll talk about them in a future work session as well. But everything I've been talking about is what's in front of you. I think the final thing about the P3 involvement, about helping folks get involved and integrated into the community and with other businesses, we believe that might be one of the biggest roles of a P3 board, is to engage with new companies that are locating in our county. We want them engaged. We want them involved. We want CEOs to be able to talk to CEOs, because CEOs speak a different language than we all speak. CFOs speak a different language than we all speak. We want them to help each other be successful in our county. And that's the point of having that private sector involvement in terms of marketing connections. Now that you have the written materials, I did want to point, if you'll go to tab 2, which is the strategic plan. It looks like this. It's got the blue cover. Does everybody have that? And go to page 17 of tab 2. I really, it's been a while since I looked at this, and thinking about today, I wanted to point out just a couple of things that are in, these are the findings of our consultant. And Mr. Chair, Mr. Walker, we talked about this strategic plan as something that the county contracted for. It was $75,000. We hired a firm out of Texas, which was a nationally known economic development strategic planning firm. They worked for 9 months in Richland County. They delivered a plan to us. And on page 17, they talk about some organizational things we need to do in order to execute the plan. And if I could, I wanted to just read a few things from it, recognizing that all of you are perfectly capable of reading this yourself, but I happen to be somebody that when I hear it, I learn it better. So under governance, is everybody with me on that, page 17? Under governance, it says, since its formation in 2009, the RCEDO, the Richland County Economic Development Office, has operated as a department within Richland County, and while the RCEDO has functioned effectively as a public entity, the highly competitive environment in South Carolina and the Southeast region for new investment and jobs compels a new approach to organizing economic development in Richland County. This plan recommends that a new independent public-private partnership, a P3, if you want to know what the 3 Ps are, public-private partnership, should be established to house the RCEDO. This is important. Privatization of county economic development is not the goal. In other words, it is not the goal to have the public involvement and the involvement of this council be removed from this process. To the contrary, it says, rather, a new P3 will allow Richland County to fully partner with the private sector and better utilize the resources, relationships, and expertise of the business community. County leadership, all of you all, will have the opportunity to work with a rising class of business leaders on growth-related matters critical to the county's future. I'll let you all, read that at your leisure. I just thought those words were compelling and striking. I thought, we asked folks for some advice about what to do. We paid a lot of money for that advice, and I thought the way that they articulated the advice was just right on point. So again, I invite you, if you don't have time to look through all this, I invite you to spend some time later, pages 17 through 18 of that particular report. And again, this has already been delivered to County Council. It was delivered and discussed in a work session back in April of 21, but it's also there in case folks need it, and it's also, Madam Clerk, in the copy I gave you in case you need to get it to anybody. All right, can we go to the next slide? Control. I think this is important. We looked at a number of different boards in the state. In fact, I was having lunch with somebody today who is the new executive director over in Orangeburg, and I was quizzing him about his board and how things work over there, and just because I knew I'd be here tonight, and I want to learn all I can about it. I feel like in discussing this with Director Rubel, having conversations with members of EDC, I feel like part of the charge here has been not just to form the same P3 everybody has. I feel like the charge has been twofold. Form a P3 that reflects who we are in Richland County, and form a P3 that shows a partnership between county leadership and private sector leadership. So our proposal, and I want to stress that, our proposal to do that is the way we've structured this board. We've suggested, subject to your input and subject to how folks feel, that the board of the P3 be comprised of 9 members. We've suggested that the chair, the vice chair, and the Economic Development Committee chair of this county council be 3 of those 9 members. Further, we have suggested that this county council would select 2 more of the 9 members so that the county council would have direct involvement in selection and or seating of 5 of the 9 members. And then we've selected that the remaining 4 of the 9 would be folks from the private sector that have sufficient gravitas to help the effort. So you'll see, if you look through this, you'll see some suggestions from me that we're talking about folks that have high-level executive titles, whether they be CEO, high-level executives, presidents of companies, folks that are willing to spend time with us, and if we need them to pick up the phone to move the needle for Richland County, they can. So that is our suggestion. Why did we suggest it function that way? Well, first, I know how important it is for the county council to have an ongoing involvement in economic development, to not feel so attenuated from this, even though incentives would come to you for approval. This county council and its economic development committee have been part of the ecosystem of economic development as long as I've been working with the county, and we're now getting close to 20 years. So we tried to think of a way to have the county council remain engaged on the board. On the other hand, we wanted to balance the board. We want to engage the private sector too. And so while we envision that 3 sitting members of county council would be on the board and the county council would select the other 2 of the other ones, we envision there'd be 6 private sector folks on this board, 3 county council folks and 6 private sector folks. Why 6? There's not a magic number. That's not a magic number. We've discussed around the state, Y'all would be shocked to know that there are boards that have 20 or 30 people on them, which struck me as way too large. There are boards that only have 5 or 7 people on them, which struck me as a little bit small. What's the right balance for Richland County? That's something I'd like y'all to think through. You know, you may say, you know what, 9 feels too small. Or you may say, you know what, 9 feels too big. You know, or to really cover all of our communities, we need to have 11. We're open to any and all of that feedback. None of that is set in stone. This is a proposal to be considered and thought through by the council. I just want to make that abundantly clear. If you go to the next slide. I'm going to do a funding, what I call a funding overview. You'll see as we get toward the end of my talk, at least, I have a suggestion that we might want to have a few other work sessions. And again, I've not even asked the clerk. I've not asked anybody about future work sessions. So I want to be mindful. I know y'all are busy, okay? So don't. And I know I'm not allowed to set work sessions. I know that too. My suggestion is we might want to have a few other ones because I think one of the things we really need to talk about is budget. And the budget and how it would work, I think is in and of itself a work session topic. But let me just talk to you generally about funding. So I told you earlier that based on our research, it looks like that at best, the breakdown of P3 funding of economic development organizations really breaks down to 80% public and at best 20% private. In some cases, it's not even 20% private funding. How would it work here? I think we would have a goal of trying to get to 80-20. That would be consistent with some of the other more mature P3s we've seen around the state. We highlight Greenville in this presentation as one we've looked at. Is that going to happen in year one? No. In year one, I've suggested that most, if not all, the funding is going to be public funding. Does that mean we won't try to raise funds? Well, no. I mean, of course, I think the P3 would be active in trying to raise funds. But we think it's important, and again, would love your input on this. We think it's important that we're not selling board seats. In other words, there are some economic development groups around the state that if you want to be on their board, it'll cost you. That's not necessarily what we're after here. We want to make sure we get the right people on the board. Do we want them to invest? Yes, we do. Do we want to make a dollar threshold a price of them joining our board? That's something that we're going to suggest to you is from a bygone era, and maybe that's not the way we should focus as Richland County. We should get the right people on the board. If the right people can donate $2,500 to the effort, great. If they can donate $15,000 to the effort, great. But we want to be careful that we don't act like we're only going to pick people that can pay. Because if we did that, I don't know that we would pick a board that is reflective of all elements of our community. We want to make sure we have all the voices necessary on the board. I think that's extremely important. So over time, where does that leave us on funding? I've just suggested to you here that we would have a 5-year march trying to get to 80-20. In other words, total budget of the organization, year 5, we get to a point where 20% of it is coming in from private funds. What kind of private funds am I talking about? Largely, they would be donations, which is exactly as what is going on in some of these other groups. Some of the groups charge annual memberships. Some of the groups sell board seats. I think how that's going to work here, part of the voice in determining what makes sense here is yours. And ultimately, part of the voice is going to be the private sector. Private sector, by the way, has not been directly engaged on this yet. You'll see when we get to the next step slide, I have some thoughts about that, about some things we might consider, but I'd like your input on it. I'd like to know what y'all think about how we should engage the private sector. So we would slowly march with the right board, with the right setup to hopefully get to an 80-20 split public-private by year 5. That's the goal. Does that make sense? Okay. Can we go to the next slide? A few more things. Yes. So we had a pretty spirited discussion at our last meeting about how does this work? You know, if there are employees of the P3, how is it that they can participate in county benefits and retirement? And so we just did the homework. We called PEBA, who is, you know, the Public Employee Benefits Association in South Carolina, and said, hey, we've talked to a number of P3s, folks that work for these outfits, and they tell us that, you know, they're able to participate in state retirement, and how does that work? And the bottom line is it works because there's an application made for the P3 because of its effectively serving a governmental function for the county and trying to relieve some of the burdens of government, PEBA will recognize organizations like an economic development P3 as an organization where the employees, as long as they put in the correct contributions, are able to participate. And so, even discussing today with the gentleman from Orangeburg, almost everyone we've talked to, through the budget of the organization, of the P3, they're covering salary and benefit costs, but are often working and running them through the county and reimbursing the county so that the employees get the requisite benefits and the ability to participate in state retirement. So that is, I would say, the most common situation we've seen. Does that mean it's the one that we have to follow? Of course not. That's feedback that we want to get back from folks. But I wanted you to know we had done that homework because that question came up last time. It is possible, it is happening, but it does require an application with PEBA. Can we go to the next slide? What's our name? Don't know. We have talked about a lot of things, and I'm remiss that the one thing I didn't bring, I told all my team I was going to bring index cards and leave them with y'all and have you write down some suggestions. So you're relieved of that burden tonight. But we wanted to just give you a sense of what other people are calling their P3s. These are all people located in South Carolina. Some of them are as simple as the Florence County Economic Development Partnership. Nothing wrong with that. Identifies where they're coming from. Then you have one Spartanburg. There's the Economic Development Futures Group. There's Alliance Pickens, the Greenville Area Development Corporation. You have Advance Dorchester. Not sure what the right name is yet for us. We really want some feedback from County Council. I'll give you a few thoughts about it. One is we appreciate this as a Richland County undertaking, and if we can figure out a way to have the county's name highlighted in the name of the organization, we'd like to do that. We'd like for the name to reflect inclusiveness. We'd like it to be something that's clear that it's for everybody in Richland County. But we also don't want to copy anybody else, right? We don't want to use it with anybody else's good idea. So I wanted y'all to see this just to get a sense of how other people brand themselves. If you want more on that, we've got it. But we just wanted to highlight some of the folks that, are in and around our state. Does anybody have a burning suggestion they want to share before we move on to that next slide? Yeah. I figured that's where we might be. Just sleep on that. And I'm sincere when I say we want your input on that. All right, we can go to the next slide. And this is by no means necessarily the end, but I just wanted to talk about kind of coming to the end of my part, and glad to answer questions. But we tried to think about what next steps on this might look like. Again, a suggestion, maybe we should have another work session or two. Why would we do that? Well, the first thing is I'm hopeful that these sessions, and after you all have had a chance to think through this, we see each other often enough, we'd like your feedback. And if you have some thoughts about this, I encourage you to reach out to Jeff, reach out to me, any of my team. Most of you have my cell phone number. And I'm glad to come meet with you individually, just to hear you out about what you're thinking about this effort. But in our next work session, I'd like to say, hey, we've had some conversations since the last work session. We've heard you. And so now we've incorporated some of that feedback into whatever areas that folks want to talk about, whatever it might be. I think we do need to plan to have a deep dive into the budget. Again, having not even spoken to Mr. Brown, that might happen naturally through your budgeting process. It might not be necessary to have a work session about the budget of this organization. It just struck me that that would be a very important thing for the council to talk about. The other thing, and we've had a lot of ideas about this, I am curious about your feedback on this, is how to engage the private sector. And let me tell you what I mean when I say that. One of the timelines we've been working under here is, if we're going to do this, we have circled, not with a pen, but with pencil. The start of the next fiscal year, July 1, is the time when this organization may take life. Does it have to take life on July 1? Of course not. If we're not ready, it doesn't have to take life on July 1. But between here and there, at least, I think it would behoove all of us to start talking to private sector folks about this. Why would we do that? One, They may just have some good ideas for us. They may have ideas about the name, they may have ideas about how it functions. They may say, you know what, I want to be involved in that, so at least we have some sense of who might serve. We'd like to generate some excitement about this. We'd like folks to understand why we're doing this, and hopefully, we'd like to put the private sector into a position where it feels more invested in what the county is doing. I am hopeful personally that private sector investment in what the county is doing will not only pay dividends for economic development, but it might pay dividends for communication and for future efforts of this county council. So engaging with the private sector is important, we think. We've had a couple of ideas about that. I'll just run them by you. One idea is to simply reach out and bring in a group of advisors, a small group of advisors from private sector companies, some of whom maybe we envision could be board worthy. Bring them together and start having a conversation to let them know about what's being discussed, to let them know about what direction the council's going in, to let them know about the reaction this council is having to the strategic plan that it paid for, and to start getting feedback. Not to get, because the entity that controls how this goes is y'all. The entities that could really help make this successful is them. And so to start having that conversation now, we think could be useful. We don't know whether any folks have thoughts about that.
I agree with those thoughts, Ray.
Anyone else?
Else?
Well, let me stop there, and just remind you, in your packet that we want, yes, sir?
Mr. Chair. And, well, Mr. Jones, thank you for this presentation. Very thorough, as always, you are. But just had a question. I'm a layperson for purposes of, our EDC. So, and maybe it's already, you have it outlined in the, this manual you provided. But what authority or what power, if any, would county council be giving up if we were to go this?
Great question. So there is a slide in there that talks about control.
Well, that's why I may have missed
Yep.
it. May have been in
No,
the
no,
packet.
that's okay.
And for what it's worth, I walked in at 4:30.
No. I think it's
Mr.
worth,
Mack, he reminded me I got here late.
it is worth revisiting, and I may ask Madam Clerk if we could go backwards about 5 or 6 slides. I just think it'd be good to have it up on the screen when we go there, but I think it says county council control and input. I think that's go back one more. Maybe backwards one more, sorry. And there you go, that one. So we envision that there are 3 critical things the county council has been involved in to date on economic development. Obviously, it's investment, the budget. It's the approval by EDC and council of all incentives. And then it's been the economic development department operating under the auspices of the county, the overall county administrative structure. In terms of budget, we don't think that's going to change at all. We think county council will have to approve every budgetary appropriation that would go to the P3. In terms of approval of incentives, which I think is really where you were headed, Mr. Chair, we don't envision the role of EDC or county council changing at all. We think every incentive request would still need to come through EDC. Every incentive contract would still need to come to the county council for approval. The one example I raised, because we were talking about this at the last EDC, and forgive me, I can't remember who all was there. I remember Ms. McBride had a question, was about the concept of the commercial development policy we have right now. So if we had a P3 right now, we would be engaging that board about what they think of this commercial development policy. Has it run its course? We talked about maybe some tweaks we might think of making to it. Would they have any suggestions on tweaks that might make it more effective? That would all still come back to the EDC. There'd be no decision-making power at the P3 level in terms of county policy, but they'd be walking alongside us if we asked them for advice on things like that. So to be clear, I think the major change would be that the EDO, the office itself, in accordance with the strategic plan, which is one of the things you'll see on that page 17, would move under the P3. I think that would be day-to-day the biggest change. But the role of council, I don't think would change at all.
So in essence, Mr. Jones, the development plant, if we were to go this route?
That's fair. I mean, the
Okay.
way it's characterized in the plan is that the EDO would be pulled under the P3, but I think practically, the EDO would be the P3, and its
And-
functions would live there.
So then the Economic Development Corporation would, well, from what I'm reading here, would vet, I guess, your potential economic development opportunities, then make recommendations to the Economic Development Committee, and we're back pretty much to the same process that we utilize now, which is recommendations going to projects going to the committee or proposed projects, and then the committee making a recommendation to full council, and then full council having to vote.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. That's plain enough. Appreciate it now, Mr. Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Many of those questions probably came from me, from the initial concept paper.
Yes, ma'am.
And it wasn't laid out as clear as this is laid out. And so, not like some of my colleagues, I'm not an attorney, but I am a very inquisitive person, so I had questions regarding those issues. I also, in terms of the authority of council, county council, under the budget area, it says that the county council will approve all the budgets, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Is that and I know I'm getting into details because I'm a detailed person at times, does that include the total budget for economic development, or does that include the budget for each of the different partnerships or ventures that we have?
I don't want to speak out of turn. I'm going to tell you how I think it works, and if Mr.
Then we
Brown-
later have that in writing
Yeah.
in terms of how it goes.
Yeah, and if Mr. Brown or somebody, if I misstep, please stop me. But I think the way the budget works now is your economic development line item, I believe, incorporates not only the operations of the office, but I believe it also would incorporate the other economic development commitments the county makes to other entities like Central SC, I-77 Alliance, and others. All of that is part of your economic development spend, for sure. Where it actually sits in the budget, again, I might stand corrected. What I envision is that the P3, whatever its name ends up being, would be a line item in the budget. And the P3 would be funded in accordance with the will of council, but that council would still make other investments in economic development as it sees fit. So for instance, if council wants to make direct investments in the community economic development efforts, into Central SC, into the I-77 Alliance, or anything else, I think county council would continue to have the flexibility to do that. But glad to explore that further, because that's one of the, recognizing that the budget might be one of the larger topics, that's why we've suggested maybe we do a separate work session on budget.
Okay.
Yes, ma'am.
And just to follow up, so I got the general concept of the budget.
Yes, ma'am.
So we have, I'll just say, $50 million. And there's a public-private partnership coming in for $20 million. But we've already appropriated $50 million. Will that new recommendation for the $20 million still have to come to council, or once we give them the $50 million, then they can make whatever decisions they want with that $50 million? Are you following me?
Yeah, let me say it back to you to make sure I am following you.
Okay.
So,
We appropriate $50 million
yes, ma'am.
to the public-private P3.
Yes, ma'am.
And out of that $50 million, they decide they're going to use $20 million.
Okay.
So for that $20 million project, since we already gave PP3 $50 million,
Yeah.
will they have to come back to council for approval for the $20 million, or they have the authority to approve that?
I think they would have to give you a budget in advance that told you how the money was going to be spent. So there might be a category, you know, in other words, they may say, we're going to spend X amount, hundreds of thousands of dollars on marketing, and that would be in the budget that you approve. If they had to move money in between categories or anything else, I think once it goes from the county to the P3, they would not have to come back to the council. Just like, for instance, When you send dollars now to a regional economic development group like I-77 or like Central SC, it's in your budget, you send a check, and then it goes into their budget, and it's being spent for marketing or whatever it might be. If they make a decision to redirect funds, they don't go back to the source of the funds. They're doing it within their own budget. So that's what's happening now. I think that's what would happen with the P3 as well.
Continuing on that same, but any initiative coming through, whatever venture we have, like if we're gonna contract with the developer or whatever, incentivize a developer, that still, regardless to how much we budget, that still has to come back to
Yes,
council.
ma'am.
Okay.
Absolutely.
And thank you for doing explaining this.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Mr. Jones, I know you said you're recommending another work session to discuss budget. And so I did have a question. I don't expect you to go into this now, but I guess as we prepare about future information, just wondering, have you done any research to say what is that appropriate initial investment for a P3 depending on size of office, staff? Is the current amount that we have now for our economic department enough? Or have you seen where we might need to allocate some more based on, I mean, Richland County is a very large county. We sit here in the capital of the state. So that's kind of what I want to see is what does the initial investment truly look like?
I might ask, Mr. Rubel and I have talked about this some. Do you want to address that a little bit, at least what you're thinking? And then,
Yes, ma'am. I think the current funding is sufficient. I think adding to that, the private sector funds would augment the current budget, and it would allow us some flexibility in how we spend the monies. But I think what the council's doing right now is certainly sufficient.
the one thing I might add to that, and this has been born out of a couple of conversations, because we've been asking that question of some of these other P3s. And I think one of the things they've suggested to us is if the whole effort is successful, if the council feels like it's successful, if the private sector feels like it's successful, if it's successful in the sense that it's drawing investment in jobs, then I think the likelihood will be both parties will want to invest more. But I think it will be based upon how functional and successful it is. What we've seen in other places is as the P3 has gone and as its efforts have gone, its private funding has gone up and their public funding has gone up too. So, but for now, it's the belief that this P3 can function under the current budgetary guidelines that the council is investing in economic development.
And one follow-up to that. So, looking at the current budget that we have we already evaluated staffing and what that looks like? And, do we have enough set aside to truly attract people to work based off the current budget?
The money is there. The constraints on wages are largely the fact that we're a county department. So there's an equity issue across the county. I mean, I could defer to Mr. Brown or Ms. Thomas, but it's difficult for the county to pay one department outlandishly or significantly more than other departments. And we certainly understand that. Being a little bit separate from the county would allow us a little more flexibility, not to have to adhere to the pay bands that we're currently under. I think that would allow us to attract higher or be competitive. It's difficult finding good people. It's competitive in the state and in the Southeast.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Livingston. Mr. Jones, do you have a sense of just how successful or effective P3s have been in other parts of the state where they are in existence? I think Spartanburg has one, Greenville may have one. So could you kind of maybe speak to that as to just how successful they've been? And when I say success, not so much the amount of investment from local government and the private sector, but in terms of being able to attract I guess, capital investment. Can you speak to that?
Great question. I'll maybe address it two ways.
Sure.
One, I want to echo some of the words of the professionals that did our strategic plan and some of what they've said, because I think they have the view of the entire country, not just the view that I have, which is largely South Carolina. The clear recommendation in the plan is to utilize a P3. I think, to your point, though, the question is, okay, why? Why do you use a P3? And is there some result-based data we can look at? So let me focus on that now. Why use a P3? If you back up and look at the areas you've just talked about, Greenville, Spartanburg, you look down, at Advanced Dorchester, you look at parts of the state. Now let me give you some company names. Boeing, Volvo, BMW, Bosch, a whole litany of BMW suppliers. Those entities are in the places you just mentioned. Why are they there? Is it just because there's a P3? Of course not. A P3 in and of itself is not going to make this go. I think the reason that they're there is because the public sector and the private sector came together and they locked arms and they said, we're going to do this together. I think that's why they've been successful. I think that's why you see so many other places trying to do this. This is the modern way of doing economic development for sure. Does it mean it's always done better that way? I'll be candid. I think the answer to that is no. It's not always done better through a P3, which is why we've been so deliberative, dare I say ponderous, in how we've been discussing this with you, because, I know y'all are elected, but y'all have invested a lot of trust in us over all these years, and the last thing any of us want to see is a failed P3 effort. We want to make sure this works in Richland County. But to your point, we've seen a tremendous amount of success in communities where the public sector and the private sector have locked arms, largely through the P3 construct, and been successful with economic development. No question.
Mr. Jones, and look, partnerships, is there within the law or within the bylaws or ordinance that's written a sunset date, so that there isn't a period where you can investigate and evaluate the success of the PP3?
I don't know that I've seen it quite like that, but let me give you some practical thoughts about that. So if you form a P3, you're forming a nonprofit corporation. It's going to have some sort of perpetual duration, but there's plenty of dormant nonprofit corporations and LLCs all over the place. I think this council has within its power, via budgetary power largely, to decide how long it wants to give the effort. Now, my suggestion is if we're going to do this, we need to give it time to get off the ground for sure. But if council looks around in 6-8 years and we don't see any of the fruit that we've been chasing after, then council would absolutely have the ability, if it chose to sunset the P3 effort.
So will there be a means of annually, and I know anything you do takes time in terms of learning the process and the planning as well as the implementation period.
Yes, ma'am.
But at what point will an evaluation be done?
I have that on one of the slides, but I failed to talk about it. Let me talk about it. If you go to the county, what about council control or what about control slide, it's about 4 or 5 away from this one, I think. One more after this one, I think. Let me see. One more after that. There it is. What about control? Now, if you'll just hit it. On the left there, we talked a little bit about what we envisioned reporting would look like. So I think at a minimum, there should be regular reporting of the P3 to the EDC, at least quarterly, about activities, structure, what's happening, metrics that need to be tracked. To your point, I think there also should be, at a minimum, an annual report done to the county council. And that report could be done in conjunction with the retreat. It could be done in conjunction with budgetary requests. It could be done and whatever pacing the council wishes. But my vision is that the P3 would be in communication with and accountable to the council as to what's happening. So I think that's how that would go, subject to the input of the council. You may say, we want something more, we want something less. I think that's the beauty of this. We're still at a point where we can talk about how we want that to go. And let me also say, let's say we go through the first year or two, Ms. McBride, and we think, you know what, we're not getting enough or we're getting too much. The beauty of the way this is set up is the chair and vice chair and EDC chair will be on the P3 board. They can carry the feedback of the county council to that P3 board and say, hey, look, we need to make sure that county council is aware of these things, or we need to make sure county council has this information. So I think it'll be a dialogue. I don't think you'll be in a position where you won't be able to make requests and have them fulfilled.
And that's right, because what you're saying, the council will have the opportunity to decide exactly what we want, if we want to go along this, even up to determine who should be on the board in terms of county council representation. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Quick comments from back to where I started out, and that is, it's really important for us to understand that we're really truly the only body in Richland County that can make a difference in economic development. As mentioned earlier, let's keep in mind that's the city can't do that. Alliance, nobody else can do that but us. So we need to take advantage of figuring out how to best do that. And I think what's most important about it, one of the most important things about the corporation is I think you get commitment and buy-in. I would say to you right now, a high percentage of the persons in our community who are the executives of major companies and so forth have no idea what our role is in economic development. So obviously, Richland County is not important to them because they're not even aware of how we make things work for them. And this would change that and allow us to be clearly in charge of economic development of Richland County. Everybody would know that that's the case. I think it's important, at least it's important for me. And the bottom line is, I think this is one way that we're going to increase investment in jobs, and that's the bottom line for me. So I think it's certainly something we need to pursue and look at, and making sure, of course, make sure we dot all the the T's, cross all the T's and dot all the I's, but at the same time, take a serious look at it and see what's in the best interest of our county. Because if something's going to happen with economic development, it's only going to happen if we do it. It can't happen no other way, anything major.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this would be its own business entity, right? Who would own it?
It's a nonprofit corporation, so it doesn't have shareholders. It just has members of the board. The bylaws would provide for how those members serve, for how long they serve.
Probably 501c3 then, is
Yes.
that? Yeah, okay. All right. And so the supposed interest of the private sector is just like, better business environment, kind of just synergies and rising tides lifting that a part of it, and then also just the marketing of the area.
I think all that's right. Our strategic plan consultant also noticed on page 17 of their report, more speed and efficiency in responding to economic development opportunities, greater access to private sector networks, industry knowledge and resources, and the added potential to engage on issues such as workforce, affordable housing, and social equity.
So we'd be able to, the corporation would be able to circumvent some of the restrictions that the county government has on entertainment expenditures.
Privately raised dollars can be spent for marketing and entertainment in a way that publicly funded dollars cannot. Yes. I wouldn't use the word circumvent.
Okay, so would the public dollars that the county funds the P3 with then be used for entertainment expenditures?
To the extent they're able to be used for entertainment as they are now, yes, sir, I'm sure they would be.
Okay. Just trying to follow along with the pros and the cons there. And then also, county employees, again, you might be able to, be able to pay them more. Is there a sense then that we're competitively hamstrung? Do we feel like we've lost out on opportunities as a result of our current structure?
I don't know that we have, maybe you do have specific examples. Is it really a matter of what we've lost or a matter of what we won't gain? I think the reason we hired a strategic planning consultant is to tell us how to move forward. And so we have been fortunate to have a strong economic development organization department here in the county now since '09. And we have had a lot of successes, and I don't want to belittle those successes. I think this is more about how we move forward than it is an indictment of how we've performed in the past.
And then, so with some of the decision making as it relates to the budget and how, budgeted monies are spent right now, those decisions are all being made by county employees right now, but under the new proposed structure, some of the decision making would be with private business sector folks. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. Is there, I think we heard a lot of what I feel like are pros, pros versus cons. Are there any cons that you wanted to share with us about the proposed P3 structure?
I think cons are in the eye of the beholder for sure. We have, and Mr. Branham, I'll get this to you, but when we first presented this to council, we gave them a briefing paper that included a list of pros and cons, just to be clear. So the cons really come down to, is formation of a P3 going to make the county council feel somehow attenuated from economic development? Is it going to take control away from the county council? Is having another party or board involved in this going to dilute the effort in some way? I think all of those are potential cons. They're all cons that we've tried to deal with as we've thought through this. But absolutely, unfortunately, there's always cons.
Okay. And then in the briefing document, is there also information related to just kind of, again, the statutory basis for, this being a proper move by the county? Obviously, other counties are doing it in South Carolina, but do you have something like that?
I mean, we can certainly prepare something.
Okay.
But no, in that briefing book, it was much more high level. But we can certainly provide the legal basis for how this would work. That's no problem.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for looking over them closer.
Mr. Chair, if I can, I just for the record, and I know the clerk wants to make sure she's got everything, I wanted to just highlight what is in the presentation materials. It's simply a copy of this PowerPoint, particularly for those who couldn't attend. At least they'll have a copy. The second thing is the strategic plan that has already been presented to council once, but it's just a copy of the very same thing that was presented in 2021. The third thing is a draft, and I stress draft, of the bylaws of the corporation. Noting that some folks might really want to kind of dig into the details of how they work, and also trying to connect the dot back to the last time we were here. I think it was Ms. Barron said to me, what are the two things we really need to be focused on? And I said, bylaws and budget. And so we at least wanted to bring some of the bylaw concepts to you. They're in draft form. They provide for 9 directors. They provide for some of the things we've talked about today. But I wanted you to at least see that they live and breathe. It doesn't mean that they can't be improved. And there's been no action taken on these bylaws. There's just a draft that we've prepared that is consistent with the presentation you've received today. So it's those 3 things that are in the briefing book.
I have one last.
Doesn't have to be last.
Well, I have a 5:30 appointment.
Or you might want to make your last one then.
Mr. Jones, in the past with the Economic Development Committee, we were so short of staff, we couldn't do much with workforce development. And of course, that's how we sell our economic development programs. So is there any type of workforce development as a part of this, or is it still totally separate? And maybe if you can't answer now, at some point.
Well, I can certainly give you some thoughts and maybe distill a little bit of what's been discussed. Workforce development is a big umbrella. There's lots of things under that. But one of the things when I first started this conversation, we talked about was leadership the county could take, getting input from the private sector about things that need to happen within either the public schools or within the technical system to respond to needs for workforce development. So I do think being in dialogue with the private sector will highlight for this council some initiatives it can take, some investments it can make, and leadership that it can undertake on that issue. I think that's a critical issue. I think anybody in economic development would tell you that if it's not land or building, the next issue that is on the forefront of everybody's mind is workforce. So I absolutely think this P3 would be involved in that.
As you heard, Mr. Jones, in terms of thinking about next steps, we'll look at what we want to include in the next step work session. In the meantime, if there's some feedback or questions that anyone might have, please forward them to Mr. Rubel, and he'll get them to Mr. Jones.
I'm sorry, Ms.
I was just gonna say thank you.
Glad to do it. The only other thing, Mr. Chair, I would say is, if we were going to engage in any way with the some sort of advisory group of private sector folks, we probably need to think about moving that forward. If we could maybe even discuss that at the next EDC, that'd be really helpful, just to get some feedback from the committee, from council, about how they feel about that. Okay.
Next item on our agenda that I can't find, I think it says adjourn.
Motion to adjourn?
Second.
It's a move in proper second for adjourn. Can you call the roll for the motion to adjourn?
Brenham,
Yes.
McBride,
Yes.
Livingston,
Yes.
Walker,
See, yes.
Mackey.
Yes.
Motion approved.
Adjourn?